Let's bring in our first guest for the hour. We've got Ian Bremmer. He is the president of the Eurasia Group, as well as G0 Media. And Ian, it's going to be an interesting few days here as we count down to the inauguration. Let's talk about the state of play in Georgia, though. Record campaign spending, followed by a record turnout, at least in a runoff race. How much of this loss, at least in one of the races, can Republicans pin to President Trump and the daily allegations of voter fraud?
I think a lot. I mean, if you look at where turnout was particularly exceeding what you were looking forward to, it was mostly for the Democrats. The Republicans didn't show up in the same numbers. We know that turnout is absolutely critical. And Trump spent an awful lot more time over the past few weeks talking about how the election is fraudulent, how it was stolen against him, than he was about the necessity of turning out to ensure Republicans keep the Senate. And there's no question. I mean, I do believe that the night before, when he did his rally in Georgia, he pivoted and did talk more about the two races in Georgia. But that's still, I mean, ultimately, when the most important message you have is that the election has been stolen, I've lost because it was stolen, it's really hard to convince the Republican faithful, the Trump faithful in Georgia, to turn out in big numbers.
Ian, the market reaction today has been an interesting one. On the one hand, it feels like investors are optimistic of bigger stimulus that would be a positive for the market. And yet you look at something a little more long term, there are some concerns about higher corporate taxes, for example. If Jon Ossoff can pull off the win, how do you see the legislative agenda shaping up for Democrats?
Definitely, you're going to, of course, you'll see more taxes, and you'll also see a hell of a lot more stimulus. And the stimulus point is the one the markets are responding to. You put it very correctly. This is a short-term play. If you think you can get an extra $2 trillion or more because the Democrats control the agenda and get the votes in the Senate, that matters a lot to the markets. And they're less worried about, sort of what else can be put. Look, there's not going to be court packing in a 50-50 Senate split. There's not going to be significant new regulations that can be pushed through. You're not going to have a major new health care bill or immigration bill or any of that. I mean, it's still, the word is going to be incrementalism, and Biden is still going to be disappointing the progressive left to a very great degree. So, I mean, I don't see a lot of the big structural changes that the left in the Democratic Party had been hoping for, had been campaigning on. Biden doesn't suddenly become Elizabeth Warren just because they've managed to flip the Senate. The thing that matters is the stimulus. And by the way, that matters a lot when you think about how we consider coronavirus rolling out in 2021, because one of the biggest concerns is that the U.S. economy is going to rebound sharply this year, but a lot of Americans are not going to feel it, and their unemployment levels are going to be too high, and they're going to get evicted from their homes and all the rest. This is a place where if they can swing both of these Georgia seats, and we aren't there yet, but if they can, that would make a material difference to a lot of Americans.
No doubt. And of course, I mean, when we talk about the risks here, as you laid them out, the division between Republicans and Democrats and what, the Biden administration is facing here was your top risk for 2021. I'd be curious to know how maybe both seats, if they do go to the way of Democrats here, what that might do to the division and the power of that being a risk here, because some people might have said, look, if Republicans may have taken one seat, it would have put President Trump and Republicans in that awkward position of saying, look, don't trust the elections, because they would have won one. But now, if you have Democrats winning both, what does that do to it as a risk in your eyes?
I mean, unfortunately, it's not just about Trump. If it was, it would be a lot easier to resolve. The fact is that the United States is not only the most powerful country in the world, we're also by far the most economically unequal of the advanced industrial democracies, and we're by far the most politically dysfunctional and polarized. It's inconceivable that in another wealthy democracy, you could have an election where it's clear that one person won and the sitting president would say, no, it's fake. And a majority of party members in the legislature would go along and say, yeah, it's fake. That couldn't happen in Canada or Australia or Japan or Germany or France. It's happening in the United States. This is truly historic. and not in a good way. And that's not going to go away with Biden taking the Senate. You're going to have a majority of Trump supporters, and indeed almost half of the country, that actually believes the election has been stolen. And you're going to have Trump out there, lame duck, and then not president anymore, but with billions of dollars available to him, by far the most important voice in the Republican Party, such as it is, saying, you've got to support me or we're going to primary you. That is an incredibly dysfunctional driver at a time that the United States is facing this unprecedented crisis. And I mean, when you put it that way, I don't see how it could not be the top risk for 2021, the most powerful country in the world having that kind of structural challenge.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about that, it does seem like that threat is very real. We hear the president's son talking about Republicans who don't fall in line, running the risk of getting primaried too. But when it comes to what President-elect Biden wants to get done, as you said there, it's not going to turn him into Elizabeth Warren overnight, but it does seem to push some of maybe those moderate fringe proposals across the finish line here, if that's the way it's going to shake out. So which policies there are you looking to perhaps even on a global stage here that you're going to see maybe impacted the most by Democrats taking control there in the Senate?
Well, I think the useful thing is that you don't have to use executive orders as much. And that is useful in terms of the legitimacy of the process as it's supposed to run, as opposed to how it has run under Obama and then even more under Trump. So when I think about being able to raise, corporate taxes a bit, raise taxes on the wealthy a little more significantly so that the deficit isn't quite as yawning given all the additional cash that has to be spent, that's something that gets through. The stimulus is by far the most important piece. Look, Biden is becoming president in the middle of the worst crisis of our lifetime. The most important thing Biden has to do is domestic. And it's about ensuring that the average American is taken care of this year and rolling out vaccines for the first 100 days, 200 days. If he fails at that, he fails in his administration. If he gets that right, he actually has some wind in his sails as we look forward to midterm elections in 2022. So far, I mean, these vaccines are incredible. They're vastly more effective, faster, and there are more of them than any epidemiologist would have expected at any point in 2020. But the rollout in the United States in early days has major hiccups. And as much as you may want to lay that at the feet of Trump alone, the fact is that we have a lot of dysfunctionality in the ability of individual states and a federal system to get this done. And that doesn't suddenly change when Biden becomes president. So I think that's the focus. I think we have to recognize that this is a crisis presidency from day one right through the first year, and he has to react effectively to that.
So what can fundamentally change once Joe Biden is inaugurated in terms of the coronavirus itself and the path of the pandemic? To your point, it feels like we're at a point right now where it's almost beyond the control of the federal government, just given how significant this most recent surge has been. We've heard the president-elect talk about mask mandates, invoking the Defense Production Act to accelerate the rollout of the vaccine. But if you're talking the first 100 days, what will fundamentally change?
I think one really big thing will fundamentally change, and that is that, fortunately, this disease isn't a lethal threat to the whole population. It's a lethal threat to a small piece of the population, the very old and those with serious pre-existing conditions. So if we can get enough vaccine out in the first 100 days, if you can, so I mean, we're talking weeks, we're not talking a year. If once you get 10% of the population vaccinated, that's almost everybody that faces a mortal threat, which means that, by the end of winter, you could have mortality of this disease at less than 10% of what it is right now. It's still spreading everywhere, but the psychology of that, the idea that none of us have to worry about the safety of those, our loved ones, those in our families, those among our friends that are really vulnerable and could die from this thing, I think it changes the mindset. I think it makes life easier. But you're still talking about a lot of spade work that has to get done to ensure that the average American feels like they have some opportunity. And again, it's not just coronavirus, that's been decades of digging into the ground, away from the equality of opportunity we want. Let's keep in mind that coronavirus is not just an issue in terms of the greater threat to the global economy. It's also the fact that we have seen so many winners from these big tech companies and those that work from them. That's how we are going to move into the post-coronavirus environment. That's great for people that work in those tech companies. It's really a problem for people in the US that don't have college degrees, that don't have that capacity, don't have that training. That problem, and we know that technology and advances in technology have been taking away opportunities from people for a long time, but that is accelerating dramatically. And that I'm not opposed to new technology. We want that efficiency. We want that growth. But if the government isn't able to step in a big way, you're going to turn a majority of the population away from against capitalism. There's a reason why this problem is more urgent in the United States than in other wealthy democracies. And it's because the US is the country that does the best at individualism and entrepreneurship and in unleashing the animal spirits in the private sector. And that is a good thing. But it also means that we have completely ignored a lot of labor in the United States that doesn't have the capacity to play ball in that environment. And unfortunately, the nature of capitalism is changing because labor is becoming increasingly irrelevant to capital. And that the coronavirus sharpens and accelerates that reality all over the world. But the average American will suffer the greatest because of our underlying conditions as a society.
Ian, I was looking back on your 2020 risks that you identified, US-China relations among the top three. It's certainly been a very rocky year over the last year in terms of what's played out between Beijing and Washington. Overnight, we saw those sweeping crackdowns in Hong Kong, where dozens of pro-democracy legislators as well as activists were arrested under the national security law. We should point out an American citizen was arrested as well. And you saw this response from the incoming Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, saying this is an assault on those advocating for universal rights. He says the administration will stand with the people of Hong Kong against Beijing's crackdown on democracy. What actually shifts in terms of the risks? There's no question the tension is going to be there. What is the new risk that comes with the Biden-Harris administration as it relates to relations with China?
And you're right to point that out. And at the same time, you also saw the World Health Organization not allowed to send their folks to China to complete this investigation into the origins of coronavirus. That's an incredible couple of actions from Beijing, basically telling the world, look, we don't care. These are domestic issues, and we're going to handle them the way we want to. We don't care about the blowback. Look, China has become much more powerful over the course of coronavirus. Their economy grew by 2% in 2020, while every other economy was shrinking. The expectation for 2021 is about 8%, we're seeing most recently. So, I mean, if you look at the trajectory, they become larger than the United States. The expectation is now by about 2028, before the end of this decade, as opposed to sometime in the 2030s. Not only that, but China is increasingly a technology superpower, something you and I have discussed in the past. They weren't 5 years ago. They're also a vaccine superpower. I mean, this year they're going to be exporting a lot of vaccines because they don't need as many domestically, since they've been able to, through their own authoritarian regime, really crack down on domestic spread, while the Americans are using it internally. Also, their vaccines don't require the cold chain that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines do. So in the emerging markets, the poorer countries, they can use it more effectively. Look, what does that mean? I saw that in the Philippines, President Duterte just a few days ago told the Americans, if you don't give me 20 million vaccines this year, I'm kicking your troops out. I think the Chinese like to hear that, right? I mean, you're going to have a whole bunch of countries that see that the leverage of Beijing over them in the near term is growing a lot. And so the level of confrontation between the United States and China on a whole series of issues, traditional issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea, also newer issues like Hong Kong and fintech and 5G. These are going to get sharper. They won't be quite as volatile. Of course, we know that Biden is not going to be sounding off by tweet. He's not going to be talking about the China virus, but it's going to be a more normalized diplomatic environment. But I think the hawkish orientation of the Biden administration towards China, and by the way, you didn't ask, but also towards Russia, is going to be very significant. And we're going to see a lot of geopolitical confrontation right out of the gate come January 20th.
Yeah, no, for sure. And already right out of the gate, as you said, important for all of the domestic policies that we're expecting to see come through here from the Biden administration as well. But Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media, appreciate you coming on here to chat. As always, be well.
Good to see you guys.